So I'm going to talk about a very recent Open Research Working Group. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about it was if there are people in the audience who also have only just set up an Open Research Working Group or are thinking of setting up an Open Research Working Group. So the Surrey Open Research Working Group is a university-wide Open Research Working Group, so rather than a departmental one, which some of them are. We launched it in February, and some of you may have heard of Surrey Reproducibility Society, which is the ECR-led society at Surrey. And you may have heard of them because of their very successful event, which they ran in May, which I've got a picture of there. And we collaborate very strongly with them. I'm going to talk to you today about three things that we've been doing. One is an open research questionnaire, which you might be interested in doing at the sort of start of any open research working group that you're putting together. And then the other two things I'll talk about very briefly because we're looking for collaborators and you might want to get involved. So the questionnaire was active from February to May. We wanted to run an open research questionnaire, partly because I'm in psychology, and in many of the events like this I've gone to, if there's ever been a poll, there's a lot of presence of psychology and life sciences. And I'd imagine it's the same today. And I think we're in a little bit of a bubble in terms of knowledge of what people's awareness is of open research. So I wanted to establish across the entire university what the awareness and knowledge was of open research, and also to help for the questionnaire to help us to prioritize our actions for the coming years, and also to help identify any training or infrastructure needs at the university. So we adapted a lot of questions that were already available, so questions from Cardiff, Royal Holloway, and the State of Open Data report, and then we added in some of our own questions as well. So the questionnaire includes questions about people's awareness and experience of open research, what they perceive as the barriers and incentives to the uptake of open research practices, where they get their training from, and any training and infrastructure needs. I won't move on for some reason. Oh, there we go. So we got data from about 500 people, which I wanted to hit a 20% response rate at a minimum. That's about as far as I could get over all those months. But just to give you an idea of what we were asking and what our results were, in terms of awareness and experience of open research, we asked people about 8 open research practices, and you can see those listed here. What we found was that there was a fairly high awareness of most of these practices, and where there were exceptions to this, it was when they were practices that were a bit more discipline specific, so study pre-registration, open monographs. Awareness was higher than people's experience of practicing open research practices, with the exception of things like open access. And so one of our goals is to try and close that gap between awareness and practicing. Open access and open data were perceived as the most important open research practices, and this was both in terms of increasing the reproducibility of research and for career development. But there was a correlation between people's awareness and people's perceived importance. So it's possible that by increasing people's awareness, people will understand the importance of some of these other open research practices as well, although obviously there are differences. I seem to have some problems with getting it to move on. There we go. So we asked people about the barriers to the uptake of open research practices, so the things that they perceived as barriers. We presented a number of different barriers, and the ones that came up most strongly were these 4 here, and this is the percentage of people that clicked on these as barriers. So lack of positive incentives, lack of information or training, lack of dedicated funding, and lack of time. And we're all quite aware that doing open research does take longer, and it's quite encouraging today to see some of these kind of integrated practices and different models of working, which hopefully will address this kind of time as a barrier for doing open research practices. In terms of incentives, there are things that we can put in through the university, but equally, if any of you have been reading some of the latest documents that have come from, for example, the Wellcome Trust, UK R&D roadmap, they talk a lot now about open research practices and embracing them, and sort of incentivizing other types of outputs other than just research papers. So the roadmap, the UKRI roadmap, talks about incentivizing outputs such as data and code, which they call modern outputs. So we will be addressing these as much as we can, but some of it will come from externally In terms of information and training, we can obviously think about what we can do to better advertise the training that we do have and increase the amount of training we have. Only 6% of people perceive no barriers, but I think even with a very sold group of people as we have today, you can see that, you know, things like lack of time are barriers to us practicing open research, but hopefully the incentives are stronger than those barriers. In terms of training, training was broadly received from the literature and from people's networks, for PGRs also from their supervisors. We found a correlation between how much people used our internal training and feedback services about open research and how much they were practicing or accessing open research practices. This is encouraging, but our internal training was not one of the main things that people were using, so we want to increase that. We asked people about all of these different incentives, and one thing that is good is that the percentages on the incentives graph are higher than the percentages on the barriers graph. And you can see the things that people saw as the highest incentives or the strongest incentives were transparency and reuse, increasing opportunities for collaboration, public benefit, and increasing the impact and visibility of research. But all of these are sort of viable incentives. So again, there's something there that we can do to try and increase people's knowledge of why you might want to do open research. So our next steps are to use the findings to formulate an action plan. So we've started doing that. And also we want to, this was a baseline before we put in any actions. And so we want to rerun the questionnaire in maybe 2 or 3 years' time to determine the impact of anything we've done at Surrey. But also, I mean, the two things aren't, we can't really differentiate, but also the progression of the open research culture at the university, which could be influenced by our actions or anything external as well. If you're thinking of running an open research questionnaire, we've put this one on the OSF, but any lessons and tips I can give, I'm happy to. The first few of these are about recruitment. So we got our VPRI to write a related blog, which was all about taking part, being part of a team and giving feedback and things like that. Then the questionnaire was launched on the back of that by his email system. And then I just kind of did a monthly follow-up email and a bit more at the end. One thing we hadn't thought about, but we've been doing since in relation to some of our other initiatives is to work with your communications team to launch the questionnaire. I also was visiting departments and faculty meetings to kind of sell the questionnaire, although this was kind of put to the end. A global pandemic does not help with response rates because a lot more things were filling up people's departmental meetings. And so I wasn't able to do as much of that as I would have liked. One thing that I really wish I'd done is we categorize people in terms of their career level and in terms of their faculty. So we could look at differences across those two different factors. But we asked those questions at the end of the questionnaire. I would, if I were to do it again, put those questions at the beginning, because if people don't get to the end of the questionnaire, then you have a very large unknown category, which we ended up with for both career level and faculty. Okay, so that was the main thing I was going to talk about. I'm just going to sort of advertise these other things that we're doing. So one thing that really struck me, it struck me when I've come to a lot of these meetings, and it struck me when I was going around different schools and faculty meetings, is that I felt like I really needed to be armed with knowledge of what open research means for different disciplines beyond psychology and beyond the life sciences. So with Camilla Gilmore and Priya Silverstein, we've been putting together a document which lists for lots of different disciplines an open research case study and then a table of sort of clickable resources, and we've split that into general resources, ones to do with open data, open methods, and open output. You might not be able to see our kind of table of contents on the side here, but we've covered as many disciplines as we thought would be relevant to people, and we're probably going to add more once we get going a bit more with this. Our disadvantage is that we're all psychologists, so I'm calling out today, if you're an expert in a non-psychology discipline, we really need your help. We've been doing a lot of Googling, but we don't want to pretend to be experts in other disciplines. If anyone would like to add to the document or sense check any of our case studies and resources, we just please do get in touch. And here's an example. So this is our linguistics page. You can see there's a case study at the top, table of resources at the bottom. And just to kind of think back to Amy's question about thought, I think all of these things can kind of integrate with one another, and it is important to kind of keep these documents live. I didn't know at the time I was doing this about the Centre for Open Science, I've forgotten what it's called, knowledge database. Ours complements that. I think what I was looking for is things that are discipline specific, and I don't think any of the other things do that, but I think that a bit of integration would be useful. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, this is the STORM project, so Study of Open Research Methods in Undergraduate Psychology Students. This is led by Katie Gilligan-Lee. We ran this year a 10-minute questionnaire targeted at undergraduate psychology students. So you may have seen it come through your psychology department. It's a questionnaire which includes statements, includes case studies and questions which we're asking respondents to respond to. We were interested in people's perceptions, awareness, experience and knowledge of open research, but we were also interested in their knowledge of the reproducibility crisis, what they've been taught about in their university course, and also whether they could explain open research to another student, and also whether they think it's applicable to them as undergraduate students. So for wave one this year, we got data from nearly 900 undergraduate psychology students, and we'll be looking at this data in terms of what year they are in their degree, and whether their university has a UKRN, so UK Reproducibility Network, local network or not, with the idea that there might have been some infiltration of the initiatives of their local UKRN local network down to undergraduates. So if you would like to be part of this, we're going to run STORM annually from January to June for 5 years. In 2020-21, so this coming year, we've got collaborators who are going to be looking at adding in some extra questions related to individual differences. If you'd like to collaborate in future years, please do get in touch with Katie Gilligan. So the questionnaire we've got is about 10 minutes. We're happy to add in another 5 minutes of additional questions. And if you'd like to follow the project, there's a Twitter handle there. Thank you.